Did you know that in Ontario there's a mandatory charging or zero tolerance policy when it comes to domestic violence? Today on Don't Talk TV I'm going to take a look at that and explain what that means. Hello, my name is Nicholas Wansbutter. I'm a criminal defense lawyer in Stratford, Ontario, Canada, and welcome to Don't Talk TV. For a number of years, domestic violence has been recognized as an especially difficult problem in Canada and something that needs special rules in order to root it out. Over the years, there have been progressively more and more laws put into place to single out domestic violence as an especially heinous crime that can result in higher sentences than an assault against a non-domestic partner, and also has specific charging policies that are different from the average crime. Now, with all other crimes, police have discretion to decide whether charges should be laid. Not so with domestic violence cases. Now, before we get into the policy, the first question is, what is domestic violence? Now, this is not actually defined in the Criminal Code of Canada, but if we look at the sentencing provisions, there is a definition of circumstances in which higher sentences will be given, and that gives us an idea of what they mean when they talk about domestic violence. So if we look here, starting in section 718 is where the sentencing provisions are. So it first lays out the purposes and objectives of sentencing. Then under section 718.2, other sentencing principles are laid out, indicating that a court that imposes a sentence shall also take into consideration the following principles. It indicates that a sentence should be increased or reduced to account for any relevant, aggravating, or mitigating circumstances. One of those circumstances is evidence that the offender, in committing the offense, abused the offender's intimate partner or a member of the victim or the offender's family. So essentially, anything that involves an intimate partner or a member of your family or that person's family is considered domestic violence. So then there's this mandatory charging policy. Now, interestingly, I can't find an actual policy anywhere on any of the Ontario government or the Solicitor General's web pages, but it's well known in legal communities that this in fact exists, and it's well known to police that there is a policy that they must charge. So I'm just going to take a look at the Ontario Women's Justice Network, and they have a page discussing what the mandatory charging policy is. So as it indicates here, mandatory charging means that police officers in Ontario have to lay criminal charges in domestic violence cases if they have reasonable reasons to believe that violence/abuse has taken place. And it indicates a little further down that this policy was introduced in 1994 by the Solicitor General of Ontario in the Ontario Policing Standards Manual. The manual contains a province-wide guideline outlining the requirements of the mandatory charging policy for police officers. This policy was the first of a three-stage government process to combat domestic violence. The three stages are as follows. In stage 1 is a direction that the police are required to lay charges in all cases of domestic violence where there are reasonable grounds to do so, brackets, proof or indications that violence occurred, close brackets. This is referred to as the mandatory charging policy. So what does that mean in practice? In practice, it means if you're in a situation with an intimate partner or a family member and you call police, someone is going to jail. Usually the male party, if it's a male and female situation. Now, you might say, well, the policy says if there's reasonable grounds to believe, but in my experience, what this is interpreted to mean is if there's any indication whatsoever that domestic violence occurred, the police will lay a charge. And the mere fact that someone called 911 is an indication that domestic violence has occurred. Let me give you an example of to what extremes I've seen this take in my career. This goes all the way back to when I was a Crown Attorney in Manitoba between 2005 and 2008. There was one case I had where police were called by neighbors who had seen a husband and wife arguing very loudly verbally. They did not report to the police that they'd seen any physical altercation, but this was very loud, angry, aggressive arguing, so they were concerned and called 911. Police attended the scene, and they saw a motor vehicle parked in the driveway with the driver's side window was smashed. So police went to the house, knocked on the door. The female party, or the wife, answered the door. She did not appear to be crying, did not appear to be injured. She was calm. She said to police, "Yes, my husband and I had a very loud argument, but there was nothing physical. Everything's fine now." And they could see the husband was in the house a little bit behind her. What the police did in response to that information received from the wife is they said, "Well, ma'am, we received a 911 call because of zero tolerance policy. Sir, you're under arrest for assault." Now, when I received that file as a prosecutor, I looked at that and I immediately withdrew it in court because there was no evidence that an assault had occurred. I had no idea. There was no evidence to explain how the window in that car got broken. There were no witnesses indicating that there had been any violence. And I remember asking the police officers involved, "Why on earth did you lay a charge in these circumstances? Clearly there's no evidence that any assault occurred." And I remember very clearly the officers told me, essentially words to the effect of, "We agree with you, but because of zero tolerance policy, we had to lay a charge and we would have been fired if we didn't." Now, whether police officers would have actually been fired for failing to lay charge in those circumstances, I question, but it was very clear to me that those officers legitimately believed they would lose their jobs if they did not lay a charge of assault against that man on that day in those circumstances. And I've seen many, many cases like that over my career as a criminal defense lawyer as well. This shows the extent to which it occurs. Now, I certainly recognize that in the media you will sometimes see articles suggesting that this isn't how it works and that there's complaints that the police still don't lay charges often enough. I think the bottom line is people need to be aware that this policy is out there and that there's a very real likelihood that if you call the police, someone will be going to jail. And in my view, you should be ready for that. And it's something to keep in mind. Do I want someone to go to jail? Is this situation serious enough that someone needs to go to jail, that my family needs to be ripped apart and someone goes to jail? Because that is what will happen. Now, certainly, if you're in danger, if you're the victim of violence, you should call for protection. I'm not suggesting to people not to protect themselves or not to seek protection, but I just think people need to know that because countless times I'm approached as defense counsel by individuals saying, "Well, I called 911 because my husband or boyfriend or girlfriend was drunk and they're out of control and I just wanted the police to come and take them to the drunk tank, and now they're arrested and charged with assault and they never assaulted me." So people clearly don't know that this is the policy and that this is what can happen. So that's why I think it's always very important for people to be fully aware of what the law is, what their rights are, and what they can expect to happen in any given scenario where they have an encounter with law enforcement or the court system. And it's also very important to keep in mind that in Canada, it's purely up to the prosecutor whether they prosecute a case. They do not need someone to press a charge as in the United States. So once that charge is laid, although the Crown Attorney will certainly take into consideration the input of a complainant, they have the ultimate say as to whether they'll drop the charges. So you can't actually get the charges dropped yourself if you're the complainant in a case of this nature where a charge has been laid under the mandatory charging policy. Now, there may be a lot to be said about whether this is a good policy or not. All I can say is, from my perspective as a defense lawyer, I have concerns over a one-size-fits-all application of any law and taking away of discretion from people like police officers and complainants who are the people who are actually in that situation seeing what's going on. I also have concerns about how this system denies agency to women who call police. Because once the charge is laid, everything's completely out of their hands, and they don't have agency anymore to decide what happens in their life. That said, there's certainly arguments on the other side, and again, the media certainly frequently argues that police don't charge often enough. In my view, generally, any police officers that I've known over the years, as a general rule, they try to do the best job they can. They want to protect people. They want to do a good job as police officers. So if they're not laying charges, they have good reasons for not laying charges. And again, that's why I have a difficulty with discretion being taken away. It seems to suggest that police don't have good judgment or they don't have good reason for declining to lay a charge. This video is not legal advice. If you're involved in a situation, you should always call a lawyer, call another lawyer, or call myself. My 1-855 number is below, and we can give you advice tailored to the specifics of your situation. If there's any topics you'd like to see me cover, please leave a comment in the comments box below, and if you found this video useful or helpful, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing.